Have you ever met someone who just made you feel uneasy without even saying a word? Have you ever met a stranger who you wish you were never left alone with? This story is about a stranger who you definitely don't want anywhere around you. Beware, dear reader. What you are about to experience is not for the faint of heart. The following story contains a tale of terror, a story that will chill you to the bone and leave you questioning your safety around fellow humans. So if you are brave enough to proceed, then read on. But be warned, once you enter this world of horror, there may be no turning back. Title: The House in the Woods, The Return of the Stranger. Simon and Molly had just moved into their new house in the middle of nowhere in France. They were excited to start a new chapter in their lives, and Simon, in particular, was thrilled with their new home. The house was large and spacious, surrounded by trees, and had a peaceful atmosphere. However, Molly couldn't shake off the feeling of unease. She felt like they were being watched, but Simon dismissed her concerns, telling her she was being paranoid. One evening, while Simon was out for a jog, Molly heard a knock at the door. She looked through the peephole and saw a man standing outside. He was tall, with a thin build, and wore a hat that covered most of his face. She hesitated but decided to open the door, and the man introduced himself as George. He claimed to be their neighbor and offered to help them settle in. Molly was apprehensive, but George seemed friendly, and she didn't want to offend him. She let him in, and he began to talk about the history of the house and the woods that surrounded it. He spoke in a low, eerie voice, and Molly could feel a chill run down her spine. She tried to make an excuse to get him to leave, but he insisted on staying for dinner. As they sat down to eat, Simon returned home, and Molly was relieved. However, George's presence still made her uneasy. After dinner, George offered to help them unpack, but Molly insisted they could manage on their own. George left, but Molly couldn't shake off the feeling that something was off about him. Days passed, and strange things began to happen in the house. Objects were moved, and they heard footsteps in the middle of the night. Molly was convinced that George was behind it all, but Simon didn't believe her. He thought she was just being paranoid and asked her to calm down. One night, while Simon was out of town on business, Molly heard a noise in the basement. She went down to investigate and found George standing there with a sinister grin on his face. He revealed that he was not their neighbor but a psychopath who had been stalking them ever since they moved in. He had been watching them and had planned to kill them both that night. Molly's heart raced as she tried to find a way to escape. She knew she couldn't fight George alone, so she decided to call the police. She managed to dial 911 and hide in a closet, praying that the police would arrive soon. George searched the house but couldn't find her. He grew frustrated and started to break things, screaming out in anger. Molly heard the crackling of the flames, and the smoke started to fill the room. She knew she had to get out of the house quickly. She crawled out of the closet and made her way to the front door. She could see the flashing lights of the police car outside, but the door wouldn't budge. The fire had already weakened the structure of the house, and the door was stuck. Molly felt a sense of dread wash over her. She knew she was trapped, and the fire was closing in. She thought of Simon and the life they had planned together. Tears streamed down her face as she realized it was all going to end here. Suddenly, she heard a loud bang, and the door flew open. It was Simon, who had rushed back from his business trip after receiving Molly's text. He had kicked the door open and found Molly in the living room, surrounded by flames. He carried her to safety, and they watched as the fire destroyed their home. As they stood there, watching the flames die down, they realized how lucky they were to have made it out alive. The police arrived and arrested George, who was later convicted of stalking, arson, and attempted murder. Simon and Molly were shaken by the experience but grateful for each other's safety. They realized that they couldn't trust strangers and vowed to always be cautious in the future. 2 years passed, and Simon and Molly tried to move on from the traumatic experience. Simon had bought Molly a golden retriever named Max to help her cope with the trauma. At first, things seemed normal, but soon weird things started happening again, especially when Simon was at work. Molly felt like she was being watched, and Max would bark at nothing. Molly tried to tell Simon, but he didn't believe her. He thought she was just traumatized from the previous incident and dismissed her concerns. He told her she was being paranoid and asked her to stop worrying. One day, while Simon was at work, Molly heard a knock at the door. She looked through the peephole and saw the stranger from 2 years ago. Her heart raced as she tried to hide, but the stranger broke into the house and killed Max. Molly was devastated, and Simon felt guilty for not believing her. They reported the incident to the police, but the stranger was nowhere to be found. They realized that he had been released from prison after spending 1.5 years and was stalking them again. They knew they had to be careful and took extra precautions to keep themselves safe. They installed a security system, and Simon started working from home. One night, while Simon was working, they heard a noise in the backyard. They looked out the window and saw the stranger standing there with a knife. Molly called the police, but they didn't arrive in time. The stranger broke into the house, and a fight broke out. Simon and Molly were able to overpower him and hold him until the police arrived. The stranger was arrested and charged with burglary, animal cruelty, and attempted murder. Simon and Molly were shaken by the experience but relieved that they had caught the stranger. They realized that they couldn't let their guard down and had to be vigilant at all times. In the end, they moved to a new city, far away from the memories of the past. They started a new life, but the memories of the stranger still haunted them. They knew that they would never forget what had happened, but they were determined not to let it define their future. The end. If you like the video, remember to like it, subscribe and share. This will greatly help with the YouTube algorithm. Stay tuned for more content. Be safe out there, my dear friend, and pray you never bump into a man like George.